Welcome to the Quantum Leap podcast, Mason.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'd like to start with just a little bit of background to help Quantum Leap fans get to know you, since everybody is so new. I've done some research. I see you have a real solid background in stage work, including last year's production of Hedwig and the Angry Inch, which I loved watching your performances on Instagram from Times Square. That was great. And I can see that you also have a growing film and TV resume, including Netflix's Cowboy Bebop. Again, I love that. And a breakout role as Desire in a little show no one's ever heard of called Sandman. And now that, you're doing all this stuff, can you tell us how you got here? How did you get started acting, and what was the road that led to Quantum Leap?
Yeah, I mean, I started acting when I was young-ish. I always loved film and television just as a medium, and when I was really, really little, I would probably around like 5 or 6, I would only watch the like special features to films that I was a big fan of, like Jurassic Park and Jaws and all that kind of, like a lot of Spielbergian stuff, on just a loop. I would sit and I would watch, like 2 or 3 hours of all the behind the scenes footage that were on the VHSs, because I was so enthralled with the process of filmmaking, not so much as an actor, not so much from an acting standpoint, but just at the sheer artistic talent that's required of all the different departments, to create something, especially in the big kind of fantasy and sci-fi world. So I always thought that I was going to be like Stan Winston. I wanted to do like animatronics and creature design in film and television. And I was just really, really into that side of the design departments that involved in big sci-fi stuff. And then that kind of, went away when I found other hobbies and other things at school. And it just was something that I like held on to as I would love to do, a big Hollywood thing. And then my parents just kind of noticed that I had a knack for performance, I guess, in life. So they put me in like an acting camp when I was 7 years old. And that was kind of the spark for me. I went to this small acting camp for like a week or two at a time, and I would do it for a few summers in a row. And the funny thing was, it was also themed. It was kind of like they definitely were working around some sort of copyright things with a lot of franchises by being like, and this is our Harry Potter camp, or this is our, Lord of the Rings camp. And you would create as a group, all of the kids would sort of come together in the different design departments and acting departments and learn how to make a play. And so you would write it with, your counselor, and then you would all costume it together and build props and then perform it in this big theater. It's called the Magic Theater in San Antonio, Texas. And so that was like my first experience performing. And then it wasn't until I was 13 years old that I got paid to act. I did a regional theater of production of Peter Pan. And that's when I first met other actors that weren't famous by any means, that sort of made an entire life as an actor, but weren't huge household names. And I don't think I had an understanding that was possible, that it was more than a hobby unless you were Jim Carrey, until then. So it was a really eye-opening experience for me, because I was suddenly faced with all of these really remarkably talented individuals who had families and had lives back, in New York or wherever they were based, and would just sort of travel around and do a couple of months in a musical somewhere and then go back home. And it was kind of very exciting to me. So I moved to Los Angeles and with my mom, and we just kind of, I guess, started auditioning and went to a performing arts school out here. And then I started working in film and television a little bit with Nickelodeon shows like iCarly, and then I went and I studied theater in college and booked the Broadway national tour production of Hedwig and the Angry Inch right out of school, and traveled with that for about a year and a half. And that was, sort of I think the big thing for me. It was a role that I had always wanted to play, and it sort of was my introduction, I guess, into the real professional world of performing. And then, I was a theater actor for a very long time. And it wasn't until recently that I started doing a lot of film and television again. The pandemic was a big, strange equalizer. And I have no idea how it happened, but it turned out to be the best time for me as an actor. Because I like in the first year, Cowboy Bebop was shooting in New Zealand, and we were like the one of the only shows in production. We were some of the only employed people in our industry. It was very, strange. So I've gotten very lucky. I've been very fortunate, and all of those shows just kind of built up on each other. Bebop to Sandman to a couple of other projects and films that haven't happened or come out yet. And then Quantum just sort of came across, and I was like, oh, I remember that show. And I didn't think of it as a thing that like was going to happen. Sandman was something I chased. It was a role that I knew I was right for and that I really wanted. And with Quantum, it was a whole new group of individuals. So nobody really had anything to base an expectation off of besides the original, but it was a continuation of that story. So every single character was additive. No one was replacing an actor or an archetype. It was just kind of building on the lore and the world that the original had created. So I had no idea or expectation of what the direction was going to be and what they were going to do with it. But I fell in love with the creative team, and we had a really wonderful time shooting the pilot. And I feel very fortunate, and I'm very excited for people to start seeing it soon.
Yeah, well, you had mentioned that you remembered the show. Were you an actual fan of the original show? Did you have a lot of basis in the original?
I think I missed the boat on when it would have been, maybe not necessarily on when it would have been on TV, but when it would have been on my radar. So it wasn't something that I really watched every episode of. It was the kind of thing that like I saw a few episodes of it growing up with my family, or it was on TV when we were, flipping channels. And so I saw these sort of like individualized stories that I vaguely remember, and I knew what the concept of the show was. And of course knew the name because it has stood the test of time, and people still love the show and still adore the original. So it's always kind of been there in the background as like a property I was aware of, but never did a proper dive into. And so when the role came about, I was kind of like, okay, I guess I'll now it's a good time to go back and watch this show.
So the character description for Ian says that they were introverted and more comfortable interacting with computers than interacting with people. But what we've seen so far, Ian is completely different from that. I think you kind of blew that out of the water. How much of Mason do you bring to Ian? And did you have a discussion with the producers or with the showrunners to make the character more dynamic as we see it on the show?
I think that it was sort of an organic evolution. When you get an audition for something, they always base these character descriptions. Sometimes it's not the creatives that write them. A lot of times it's the casting office that they read a script and they kind of, build their own idea of what the text means and what, they should be looking for as casting directors. So in this case, it's very possible that was written by our casting director at the time and wasn't written by, Brian or Steven or Martin. So we, that sort of flew out the window, I think, day one. We I had a Zoom meeting and sort of read parts of the scripts from it. And I think they realized very quickly that my version of Ian could take some of the geeky person behind the computer stuff and allow that to exist, but also make them a little more dynamic and relatable and real, and less of like this, I am, a non-binary person that's kind of insular and only can be friends with computers. Cause I think that that is a trope that is sort of played out. There's very little non-binary representation in film and television, but our first experience with non-binary identities on TV for most people is Taylor Mason in Billions, and that description could apply to both of those characters. So I think that it's really interesting to see how like one archetype from just the only amount of representation that exists can sort of pervade into all these different people's minds when they think, oh, like that's the kind of character I want to write. And then they go like, the only frame of reference I have is that one character from, from this other TV show. So I think there was an element of that still existed. And then everyone met me and was like, oh yeah, no, this makes way more sense. We should kind of just naturally follow the progression of where this Ian exists. And I think it's helpful, not only for me, but for the show as a whole, because we've leaned heavily into this kind of familial dynamic that a lot of shows of this type don't necessarily have from the jump. I think a lot of them develop it over time. It's sort of this ragamuffin, group of individuals that work together. But in our version, like we've been working together for 5 years on this program. So it's nice to see from the jump that there is 5 years of history and that we're not learning to like each other at this moment in time. Like everyone already has a relationship to one another. And yeah, so that was a nice deviation from the character description.
That's also a deviation from the history of Quantum Leap, because usually we got very little back at the project. And one thing that comes across right away in the pilot is that family dynamic that you were discussing. But also, as Ian, you're filling a role at the project that was only explored through the character of Gushy. Very, very little in the main series. So you're interacting with the project staff, but you're also the main conduit to Ziggy. So first of all, I have to ask, because, fans and listeners are dying to know, will we have to wait long before we get to see you interact with Ziggy?
That's a great question. I feel like there are a lot of sweet moments, but I think in the way that people are anticipating, I can't say when or how it will happen, but I'm sure it's going to happen, because you can't have Ziggy and not really dive into just how sassy and fun that creation is. So I would say that we'll all just hold our breath and wait and see.
All right, now my next question, you might not be able to answer it, but what was it like working with Deborah as she reprised the role?
Well, as of now, Deborah has just been on set pretty much almost every day as in a producerial context. So we've really just gotten to know each other and have her present as kind of the curator for the whole experience. Deborah is really remarkably giving and really wonderful to have involved so heavily, especially, considering how unbelievably important she was to the original and is to our version. So it's really nice that there's this continuation of her involvement in the show. But in terms of her specifically as Ziggy, that I cannot discuss yet.
All right. Fair enough.
That means there's something.
Who knows?
How can we expect to see that dynamic evolve as the series progresses? What other key relationships will help define Ian?
I think it's really nice to watch the way that the story that happens within the leap kind of has that ripple effect on the people that are in the present and vice versa, which is something that the original didn't have as many opportunities to explore or expand on, since we never really spent any time at the headquarters. So all of the information was kind of being fed through Al. And in our version, an element of that still exists with Caitlin as Addison, still disseminating information to Raymond as Ben. But there is a nice amount of time in each episode that's spent developing the characters and the relationships in the present. And it's really cool to see. For me as an actor, I've loved watching or interacting with, Raymond very minimally, but with Caitlin and Anarissa and Ernie to kind of develop the individualized quirks of each person back at the headquarters, because like it really does deeply impact the way that we tell the story in each episode and the way that we sort of reveal the mystery or the way that we dive into whatever that time period is. Each person brings their own experience to that, and I'm very grateful that they are all such giving, wonderful actors, because it's so much fun to kind of just play with them and bring enough of ourselves to the roles that I think that also helps strengthen the relationships between everybody. Because, you know, like I don't know if in earlier drafts of this, had they not known all of us and not known how we interact, if there would be as much of of a historical connection between like Ben and I as best friends, or Caitlin and I as like unbelievably close individuals, Addison. And a lot of that came from just the way that we interacted in real life, you know, the way that like we were just razzing on each other day one, and like truly all really felt like family from the beginning. And so I think the natural just inclination to write to our voices and write to our actual interactions and relationship has bled so wonderfully into the series that all of the relationships have been strengthened because of it.
The pilot felt very tailored to all of you because you guys had a chance to do it twice. So you really had a chance to hone in on these characters and make it your own thing and closer to each other.
Yeah, because, you know, when you get a script, like you pretty much you do what the script is, right? And there are moments of being able to deviate from that, but it is very, very rare with the time constraints of filming an episode of television that you can come in and just radically change everything. So the repilot gave us an opportunity to really reevaluate how we wanted to reveal certain aspects of the story, and also how we wanted to establish everyone's relationship early on. Whereas I feel like if we would have continued with the original draft, the original pilot, and sort of built on that, it might have taken a few more episodes to fully understand how like deeply involved everybody was in each other's personal lives. Whereas like starting with that engagement party, it's so clear and so immediate that like these people don't just see each other at work. We get together afterwards, and we are present for each other's big moments, and we are deeply supportive and deeply loving of one another. So the repilot really allowed us to show that from like the get-go, as opposed to making audiences kind of wait for those relationships to kick in, which I find to be so much more fun and enjoyable as an audience member.
It's very much organic, and it came across.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier about sort of moving away from that, the trope of the insular non-binary, and it's fantastic to see non-binary representation in a character in network television. What we've seen so far, I mean, we've seen the pilot. I read that original script that has now shifted up to episode 6. The non-binary element doesn't seem to have really come to the fore yet. Is that something that might be explored with Ian more in future episodes?
I mean, I think it depends on the way that we continue to, craft the stories in this series. I'm sure there are so many opportunities with Quantum Leap to introduce audiences to concepts and ideas that, in the original were like, looking back, you'd be like, oh my God, of course, they did. But it's incredible to see what they were able to accomplish in the time that they were writing those episodes in. And I think that the same can be said of our version, because there are always different people that need to be introduced to greater audiences in order to help build empathy with, the masses. And I think that Ian's inclusion in the show isn't intentionally for that purpose. I think it was the way that our cast was brought together is just to represent the way that the world kind of, just looks and exists now. That group of people is exactly the kinds of groups of people that I see in every situation. I mean, there might be some age differences and like other things which are kind of fun to play with in a work dynamic. But like for the most part, I don't know many people in my experience that only have a very insular view of the world and only see the same, like, the kind of person all the time. Like everyone is constantly being introduced to to people of different races and ethnicities and gender identities. And I don't think that at this moment in time, Ian's function in the story is to deliver some kind of diatribe on what it feels like or what it means to be non-binary, because it's not necessarily what the focus of the show is. I think that Ian's inclusion in the world is the radical move for them. And it's almost more powerful not to try to, do anything with that, because the normalization of our existence is the most important thing. I mean, like I am so tired of getting scripts that revolve around a coming out story for, a queer individual, and that kind of being it, or revolve around their relationship to their parents being, strained or being positive. It's like this reward system, that make other people feel good for like being empathetic to this person. And it's almost more powerful just to see that person in the room and get to know them and be friends with them, and their dialogue not necessarily have anything to do with their identity, which is what they've set up so far. And I know that, there will come a time, there will come an episode where I'm sure we will dive into what it means to be trans or what it means to be non-binary, because how could you not? But as of now, that is, not coming into play, because we have so much story and so many other things to sort of work through, which is really fun and makes me feel very good about as an actor, because I just feel like an actor for once, as opposed to similar to Sandman. Like I felt like an actor who got to show up to work and play a part and play a character, instead of having to, go through the bells and whistles of being like, and now we have to, introduce our audience to this concept and make them feel comfortable with this kind of individual. And you're just like, or we could all just show up to work and put on clothes and deliver lines that have to do with the story. And once it has to do with the story, it's going to be wonderful and well worth, the payoff and the wait. So I'm excited to eventually get to a point where we get to talk about it. But for now, it's so great not to have to.
That's terrific. Now, I mean, you had mentioned getting dressed. One of the things that we see that Ian holds in common with Al is those fabulous outfits. So carrying through on that part of the show.
That pink suit. So good.
Yeah, there are some great ones, great looks.
Did you coordinate with the costume designer to nail down Ian's look, or did they come at you and say, hey, this is what I got?
I feel like it's always a blend of both. I'm very hands-on when it comes to costuming. I think that it's one of the most important aspects of character building for, in my process. And so I really like to be able to be there from the start and sort of build the skin of the individual, the exoskeleton, because, so much of clothing is external representation of how an individual sees themselves, or how they want to be seen. So it's always fun to think about, like what would this person wear? How would that affect their day to day? And what does their closet look like? So we built a closet for Ian where we just like tried on hundreds of things and sort of very slowly like tried to figure out what are things that Ian would actually have, what would they wear. And so a mix of it is balancing that with what, a network thinks a late 20s something, programmer might wear. So it's like, it's always a million cooks in the kitchen and isn't always, the easiest of processes. But between me and the designer, we are having a blast kind of just throwing a bunch of things at the wall and seeing what sticks. But that pink suit is awesome. I think that now we're hitting the stride. I feel like episode, 5 or 6 is right where I'm starting to be like, yep, this is what Ian feel like wears, and before then there are so many fun things, and there will be many after that, are definitely pops beyond what this person might be. It's very Al adjacent, he wore some crazy stuff in the best of ways.
We can't wait to see you in the control room holding an old school hand link. And we know that your time is limited. So are there any aspects of Ian that we haven't touched upon, or of the story or the show that we haven't touched upon, that you'd like to explore, or any tidbits that you want to give away to eager fans?
No, it's hard when you're in the beginning of a thing. There's so little that can be said, but I hope that people really, really enjoy the first episode and can go along, for the long haul, go along with the ride, because as someone who has a lot of experience now in just the last few years of adapting popular IP, I find the aversion to things continuing or things being reimagined into other mediums to be very shocking as a fan of stuff. Because when I was, I still am a massive fan of a lot of the things that I was a fan of when I was a kid, and a fan of newer things that, I don't understand the fear of having more of that thing, because to me, it never, ever would impact the original or my experience with seeing, Quantum Leap, or seeing Cowboy Bebop, or reading Lord of the Rings, for the first time. And the toxicity in certain fandoms around, like, people of color and queer people kind of being included in those worlds has been so disheartening and shocking. Considering we're in 2022, and I'm watching every TV show that's on right now in the fantasy and sci-fi space sort of grapple with the same headlines and same conversations. We did it with Sandman. They're doing it to Lord of the Rings. They're going to do it to Quantum Leap. They're already doing it, I'm sure, to Quantum Leap. And it just makes me sad, because these shows are about humanity and about empathy. And this one in particular is about learning how, through walking through other people's shoes. The entire concept of Quantum Leap, the original, is built around the concept of empathy and kindness. And so I'm really happy that we're going to continue that tradition. I think the world really needs it now. I think that more optimistic shows like that should exist, and more shows showing the diversity of the human experience should be deeply welcomed. But to anyone who is afraid of this new version, or afraid of new versions of anything, I would just say it should in no way impact your experience with this thing that you loved and with the original. Even if you don't like something, or you don't like a character or a storyline, or you don't like the show at all, that's okay. Then you will always have Quantum Leap. You will always have the first Quantum Leap, and that's so amazing. It's so cool. And so maybe just have fun and enjoy the fact that there's more of it. and that would be, my best advice for anyone that wants to leap into it. Because leaping in all of this with kind of a fresh perspective, and this release of the desire for something to 100% be the thing that you need it to be, I think will be very helpful in everybody's ability to enjoy new adaptations of everything moving forward. Because we should be encouraging more fun and creativity with things that we enjoy, and especially including a more wide, diverse range of voices being involved in those properties.
Wonderfully put. Well, thank you so much for being an integral part of carrying on the legacy of the show that we all love. And thank you so much for appearing on our show.
Of course. Thank you for having me. I'm very, very excited for y'all to watch more episodes and sort of dive into it all. So thank you.
Thank you.